So one of the key principles that we will talk to you about in our online courses is this principle of central nervous system offloading. So if you look into any movement control research, they will talk about the importance of the central nervous system to exploit specific properties of the musculoskeletal system. And this is very, very important to allow for efficient, pain-free movement. Okay? And so what we can consider is that if an individual is thinking too much about their movement, if they're very conscious in their movement control, they're typically not a very robust mover, or they're typically not an individual that can handle an awful lot of stress. And you might have seen this in your clients. Let's say we have a client with back pain. If a client with back pain is moving with a very conscious control strategy, and you ask them to bend down and touch their toes, typically what you'll find is that they have to stop and think about how they're going to do it. They will pre-plan their movement and think about it far too much, which is a very inefficient strategy. So they'll think and stop, and they'll be very, very cautious about how they actually go about the activity. And so usually what happens is when an individual is in pain, or when an individual has movement restriction, they're typically unable to offload resources from the central nervous system into the musculoskeletal system. So we need to ensure that we can prove to the central nervous system that we can take advantage of specific properties, specific qualities throughout the body, throughout the musculoskeletal system, so the central nervous system can take a back seat. The key principle here is that when the central nervous system is too involved with movement, we're thinking too much about our movement, we're too conscious with our movements, that's when our robustness is going to be reduced. That's when we're going to have a very hard time handling more stress acting in our body. And this is extremely important because there are certain properties that the CNS exploits throughout our body to allow for this offloading to occur. One of those properties is the expression of biarticular muscles throughout your limbs. So if we look at the lower limb, for example, the lower limb is made up of many, many different muscle tissues. But if we look at how the lower limb and the limb as a whole is different to the midline, we will see that the muscle mass will get lower and lower, or more reduced, as we move from proximal to distal. And there's a reason for this. There's an energetic efficiency reason for this. Is because as we move from proximal to distal, we have more tendinous tissues. Right, so you can see the difference between the midline and the limb. We have much longer muscles. And within those biarticular muscles, we have more passive, more non-contractile components. And the reason we have those properties is because that allows us to share stress very well throughout the lower limb. So the lower back or the midline doesn't have to do an awful lot of work. That is going to be the key with allowing for the lower limb to be a good quality force dampener, we will call it, to allow the lower limb to maintain its nice adaptability, to be reflexive. That is the key with this. And so when we're approaching lower limb pain or movement restrictions, for example, we want to understand, can the biarticular tissues function to dampen stress, function to reduce stress, to dissipate stress well? Because if we look at the biarticular tissues, if we look at the rectus femoris, for example, the hamstrings and the gastrocnemius, those are the main biarticular muscles that we want to take advantage of if we're trying to really build a robust, efficient lower limb. Now, one of the main functions of biarticular muscles is to transport energy, to transport stress across multiple joints. It's there to actually make multi-joint movement much more controllable, much more efficient, so that our central nervous system doesn't have to exert as much control. So this is just one example. These biarticular muscles, their ability to tolerate stress, to handle stress, so that our central nervous system doesn't have to exert as much control. We want to show you many different strategies, many different assessment and rehab strategies to have more influence over these tissues, amongst many other principles that allow the central nervous system to offload energy, to offload resources into the musculoskeletal system. Now, in the next video segment, we're going to show you what might happen if the individual loses the ability to take advantage of these biarticular tissues and to allow the lower limb to handle stress well, so that the midline can express more of a reflexive, adaptable platform. We're going to show you what might happen if that occurs with more of a clinical scenario example.